So hello and welcome to this NPTEL course entitled Trauma and Literature. We just finished Catherine Mallory's book, The Ontology of the Accident, and we will start with a new text today. So we'll start with Joseph Heller's novel Catch-22. We won't start with the text today per se, but we'll talk about the background of the novel and how it connects to a course like this. I mean, in what sense is it an important novel for a course such as Trauma and Literature? So some of you may have read it. It's a very, very popular as well as a famous novel. It's critically acclaimed as well as being a bit of a bestseller. So Catch-22 by Joseph Heller is a war novel. It's set in the setting is Second World War. So the protagonists, Wozerain and other people, they are around the Second World War. And it's an army novel. It's about the demography. The characters in the novel are mostly army people, army officers. And it is sometimes set in medical wards, it is sometimes set in civilian spaces, but the war is very much a presence, a direct presence in this novel by Heller. Now, the reason why I chose this novel in this course is because it offers a very different kind of perspective to trauma. There is a very distinct presence of PTSD. There's a very distinct presence of post-traumatic stress disorder. But the way it is represented, that makes the novel very complex as well as interesting. There is a certain quality of comicality in the novel. It's a funny novel, and which makes it really interesting as well as strange, because the theme in the novel is war trauma. The theme in the novel is the terror, the horror of the war. We have accounts of people dying, brutally killed, massacred, mutilated, violently attacked. Sexually attacked. So all those themes, all those actions are there in the novel. But the overarching mood in the novel is one of laughter, which brings us to the very interesting location of laughter in trauma studies. So that's something which we need to discuss and perhaps unpack a little bit. Because when you talk about trauma studies, when you talk about trauma and literature, the more prevailing, the more prevalent model is to look at despair, depression, psychological confusion, disintegration. In other words, very negative characteristics, very negative attributes of the mind, which correspond to the traumatic situation. That's the commonly consumed notion of trauma. That when someone becomes traumatic or traumatized, then the prevailing sentiment becomes one of sadness or terror or shock, any of these negative attributes. But where and how could we locate something like laughter in trauma studies? Because a very quick and immediate response to this would be the laughter is the opposite of trauma. Laughter is the opposite of sadness. I mean, if trauma is equated with sadness and despair and loss, the laughter cannot be a part of trauma studies. But we have very interesting examples in literature as well as in scientific study, which shows that laughter could be a very interesting instrument to investigate in trauma studies, because the kind of laughter we're talking about is sometimes a tragicomic laughter, and it's also a laughter of exhaustion to a certain extent. It can be laughter of cynicism, a laughter of it's an irrational laughter of liquidation. Something is shut down, has come to an end, is exhausted, so that laughter can emerge out of that. So in other words, it's not a laughter of production. It could be a laughter of nihilism, a laughter of annihilation, a laughter of exhaustion, a laughter of disintegration. So that can just be the only motor and nervous response in a situation of trauma, where you're too numbed to be shocked, you're too tired to be shocked, and then laughter is the only motor mechanism available, right? And in a certain sense, we could connect this to what Malibu talks about in Ontology of the Accident, as well as in The Wounded, as the entire concept or experience of cognitive flatness, that you're too flattened out, you're too numbed to react with any kind of consistent negativity or any kind of consistent response in terms of sadness or shock or whatever, because the degree of trauma is such that it has numbed you completely. So that kind of a cognitive flattening of effect is something which we can interestingly connect to while looking at laughter, because laughter can become a very interesting agency, a very interesting activity to look at in trauma studies, because it can be a motor response, it can be a subversive response, it can be a challenge to authority, it can be a challenge to the situation of trauma, and also it can just be a very irrational nervous and motor response to a sad situation, right? So that can also be a reflection or an index of irrationality, sometimes insanity. Laughter can also be, it's a manifestation. It could be a manifestation of insanity or irrationality or any situation. So, in that sense, laughter can be a darker form of representation than, let's say, sorrow. A darker form of representation than despair, because it's that kind of representation where the rationality of senses, the logical causal quality of the sense perceptions and the responses arising out of those sense perceptions, that gets interrupted, right? So laughter can be seen as an interruption of the causal logic of sense perception. So in that sense, a book like Catch-22 by Joseph Heller, which is predominantly a funny book, we need to take a look at the funniness or the comicality of the book as a very complex cognitive condition, right? And we're obviously not going to read the entire book because it's not feasible to do it. We'll look at certain selected passages from the novel, but we'll keep sort of examining the quality, the performativity, and the embodiment of laughter in this novel. Now, connected to this is the quality of narration, because at the end of the day, it's a book of fiction, a literary fiction, and the fictionality of the novel is something which we need to sort of look very closely, and because this is a course on trauma and literature, so we need to take a look at the literariness of representation. Now you find that the predominant mode of narration in this novel is non-linear. Right, so there's no linearity in space and time. So the spatio-temporal causal logic, the linear logic, that gets constantly interrupted. So we have different kinds of merging of different temporal frames, spatio-temporal frames, and this merging of spatio-temporal frames makes the quality of the novel slightly carnivalesque in quality, and that's one word that I'll keep coming back to: carnivalesque. C-A-R-N-I, carnivalesque, V-A-L-E-S-Q-U-E. So the word comes from carnival, the ancient classical tradition where, for one day the Pope would dress up as a pauper and the pauper would dress up as a pope. So in other words, the entire social logic will be inverted. And that was seen as some kind of a release phenomenon. So all released rage, released repression, that all gets vented out in a carnival. So the carnivalesque is a quality that comes out of that kind of an event, and it's a term used by Mikhail Bakhtin along with several other terms such as polyphony. That's another word which we'll use, another concept which we'll use in looking at Joseph Heller's Catch-22. Polyphony as in many voices, poly as in many, phony as in voices, sound. So polyphony, many sounds, many voices, different perspectives, different points of view. So the same event can be narrated, can be represented from different points of view. So in a certain sense, Catch-22 is a very postmodern novel. It's a novel about the breakdown of logic. It's a novel about the interruption of linearity. It's a novel about the playfulness of points of view, different focal points that are operating simultaneously. And obviously what that does is that it completely deconstructs the ontology of the event, right? So we just finished Catherine Malabou's book, Ontology of the Accident. But even when it comes to an event, something which happens, something which transforms things, something which emerges out of an existing situation and sometimes transforms it, that definition of the event, even that gets interrupted and constantly deconstructed in this novel, sometimes by laughter, but mostly by interrupted narrative styles, non-linear narrative styles. And the other important quality in the novel, which we'll tap into in some details, is the production of paradoxes. So what is a paradox? A paradox is a situation where we put together two contrasting logical narratives and produce a quasi-logical structure out of it. So you have logic A and logic B, which don't quite connect and then put them together, and then you have some kind of an alternative logical system, excuse me, emerging out of it. And again, the prevalent sentiment, the prevalent mood that emerges out of such paradoxes is laughter. But then again, it's a non-innocent laughter. I mean, it's not. I mean, almost every laughter is not innocent, but it's a laughter which comes at a cost of something. Sometimes a cost of life, sometimes a cost of hope, sometimes a cost of optimism. So it is more often than not the laughter of nihilism, as I mentioned, the laughter of nothingness, the laughter not of hope or aspiration. I mean, though the novel ends with a forward-looking sentiment is about Yoserin trying to go to Sweden, Sweden emerging as some kind of a utopia for him. That's the final image in the novel. But, you know, throughout the novel we have different kinds of laughters emerging and true paradoxes. So the production of paradoxes in the novel is very important, especially given the traumatic or traumatized situation, because, you know, quite clearly the inhabitants in the novel, the characters in the novel, they suffer from PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, although that is not classified at that point of time. This is the Second World War, and as some of you know, PTSD as a medical term, as a medical jargon, as a medical classification, only came into being in a definitive sense after the Vietnam War, right? So that becomes the war which changes the entire nature of war trauma and how it is perceived in medical discourses. Now, so Catch-22 is a funny novel about trauma. It's a novel with paradoxes. It keeps producing different kinds of paradoxes, and, you know, it represents the traumatic situation, the traumatic event, through repetition, which is sort of Freudian in quality. The trauma keeps coming back. But then what also complicates it further is a non-linearity of such representation. It sort of constantly produces its own interruptions to a certain extent. And the production of paradoxes, the production of interruption, the production of comicality, which is situated against authority, all these make the novel quite carnivalesque in quality, and also quite postmodern in quality, because all the classic traits of postmodernism, non-linear narration, multiple points of view, different focal points, the auto-deconstructive quality, it keeps deconstructing itself, sometimes metafictionally. So all these qualities are there in Catch-22. I mean, that's one of the reasons why it is a very commonly cited novel in postmodern studies. But it's also important for us to look at it in this course from trauma and literature, not least because it looks at laughter and you know, the whole idea of paradox, funny paradox, as a way of representing trauma. So this is not a laughter of happiness. It's a laughter of, you know, nihilism. It's a laughter of emptiness. It's a laughter of nothingness, really. It's only available motor mechanism. People can just laugh about it. And of course, paradox becomes the instrument to represent that state of being, where you have different kinds of logical narratives coming in together, very contrasting logical narratives which don't quite cohere, which don't quite connect. And this disconnect and incoherence is exactly what is foregrounded in the novel, and sometimes almost celebrated in a very dark way. So that dark comical quality is something which we need to put a lot of attention to. So on the surface, it has, you know, a third-person narration, so there is this omniscient third person, but then there's also this different points of view which come in, and different characters are focalized to different points of views. There are separate storylines which come in together, sometimes they're out of sync, so, you know, the timeline on the novel, you know, develops along with the plot. So the plot and the time, they sort of come together, and they are sometimes out of sync. So different kinds of timelines are put together. It's not necessarily always chronological in quality. And again, this non-chronological quality of narration is something which we need to pay attention to. So, as I mentioned, this is set in the Second World War, specifically about 1940 to 1944, and the protagonist in the novel is someone called John Wesserain, and, you know, Wesserain is someone, Wesserian is someone who is very commonly cited as one of the most famous anti-heroes in fiction, especially postmodern fiction. Now, what is an anti-hero? And that's something which we will keep coming back to, because that is sort of connected to the quality of laughter. It's connected to the quality of paradox and carnivalesque and all the rest of it, the quality of the anti-hero. So who is an anti-hero, and why is the character of the anti-hero, the presence of the anti-hero, an important quality in a novel like this? So an anti-hero is obviously someone who deconstructs the quality of traditional heroism, someone who's not good looking, not chivalrous, not heroic, not glamorous, but is sometimes cynical, sometimes hollow, sometimes on the verge of villainy, but not quite a villain. So that blurring borderlines between good and evil is quite obviously there in an anti-hero. So he's not someone who is definitely evil, but he's not a glamorous hero either. So that kind of a suspension between good and bad, between evil and nobility, is something which we find in an anti-hero. But one of the common qualities of the anti-hero is exhaustion. And a cynicism which emerges out of that exhaustion. So an exhausted person, someone who had once been a romantic, someone who had once been idealistic, but through different fatal blows of time, he or she has come to a position of exhaustion, of emptiness, of nothingness, and there is a lot of cynicism which emerges out of that. So the quality of the anti-hero, especially the way it is represented and embodied by John Wasserian, is important. And Wasserian obviously is a military soldier, is someone who works in the U.S. Armed Forces, and that battalion, this B-25 Bombardier Battalion, is a very important presence in the novel, because that is an all-male space, and then we have different kinds of relationships emerging out of that B-25 battalion, the armed forces, the Air Force of U.S. Army, operating in 1942-1944. So, and that is sort of based near the sea. So again, near the Mediterranean Sea, and so the presence of the sea is quite symbolic, because on the one hand there is this claustrophobia of the war, where all these men are huddled together all the time. There's no possibility of freedom, and on the other hand there's this endless, limitless sea surrounding them. So that spatial contrast is quite interesting and quite pervasive, and it's something which we need to pay attention to. The spatial, the complete difference, the stark difference in spatiality, right? The huddled claustrophobia of the squadron as against the endlessness in a free-flowing sea. So that becomes quite interesting. Now, what this means put together, so we have the tragedy of the war, the horror of the war, the brutality of the war, the casualty of the war, and then we have this feeling of funniness, which is not happy funniness, but the funniness which comes out of tragedy, the laughter which emerges out of tragedy, morbid laughter, gallows humor. So the kind of humor or the kind of joke that is morbid in quality. It's got a very close association with death and nihilism and emptiness, right? So in that sense, it becomes a darker representation of horror and trauma than, let us say, melancholia. Because in melancholia, there is a consistent set of emotions. It just becomes sad to sadder. There's sorrow, that is despair. There's a consistency in terms of the sentiments operative. But when it comes to the carnivalesque representation of humor, of tragedy, then it is more complex, cognitively speaking, because there is a sadness, there is a despair, there is a sense of having lost someone who's very dear. But then again, there is the quality of laughing at it, which is almost irrational in quality, and which pushes the suffering a notch further, because that sort of brings out the hollowness and the emptiness of the sufferer. Now, at a macro political level, what all this means is that this novel also becomes a critique of the war, a satire, so to speak, about the war. And the war, the way it's represented, we know quite clearly there's nothing heroic about the war, there's nothing glamorous about the war, but instead it just appears as an absurd spectacle of suffering, which is completely meaningless, completely purposeless, and hence the irrationality of representation becomes a very interesting mode to represent what is happening. So the manner and the matter are quite interestingly dialoguing with each other. The matter is absurd. It's about the absurdity of the war, the complete spectacle of meaninglessness, the spectacle of purposelessness. That is the matter of the war. And the manner in which it's represented is also absurd. So there is no chronology. There are different points of view. There is laughter at a sad situation. So, the manner and matter, they connect to each other in very complex ways. And both, in certain senses, are reflective of the absurdity and irrationality of the war. And that just becomes the interesting quality throughout the novel. Now, as I mentioned, that there is a very distinct postmodern quality of the novel, the different timelines coming in together, sometimes merging, sometimes disconnecting, and that disconnect becomes important as well. And of course, there are this constant production of paradoxes, which are satirical in quality, which are nihilistic in quality, and also which serves to disturb and rattle any linear, seamless narrative of time or sentiment or emotion. There is no stable emotional economy in Catch-22, but instead we have a very unstable, mercurial and mutable economy of emotions. That's something which we will keep looking at. Okay, so I will stop at this point today. This is just an overview of the carnivalesque quality, the tragicomic quality of the novel, the farcical quality of the novel, and we'll talk about farce in some details later, because there is a sense of reputation about farce, and this very famous statement of Marx's, first as tragedy, then as farce. So farce can be seen as sort of flattening out of tragedy. The tragedy which is beginning to lose its tragic grandeur, but it is beginning to become banal in quality. It's beginning to become repetitive in quality because of, it just keeps coming back. So after a point of time, it just become numbed and begin to laugh at it. There is no grand sorrow which emerges out of that anymore, and that is there's a function of repetition. It's a function of sort of a recycling of the same thing. It just happens as a ritual. There's a ritualistic quality, a repetitive quality about it, which takes away the tragic grandeur, the tragic poetry out of it. It just becomes a routine of loss, a ritual of loss, which just becomes almost comic in quality because of its repetitive quality, because of its repetitive nature. So that farce is a very important thing, which is obviously connected to the quality of comicality, carnivalesque, right? So carnivalesque in itself contains a farcical quality, and that's something which we will keep seeing throughout, the novel, especially in the way the anti-hero protagonist operates, Yossarain, in terms of how he's always sort of suspended between the good and the bad, between the comic and the tragic, between the meaningful and the meaningless, between the heroic and the shameful. So that the constant suspension, the constant liminal presence, the constant blurring of borderlines between the oppositional attributes makes them a very unique and appropriate embodiment of the sentiment of the novel, which is a entanglement of different kinds of emotions, which are quite asymmetrical in quality, and that asymmetry is also important. We can't quantify, you can't have a symmetry of emotions over here, because it's just a repetitive cycle of loss, and so it just becomes farcical in quality in the end, right? So this is the background, the structural background, the qualitative background of the story, the novel, and we will obviously start looking at certain selected passages and also refer to some of the scholarships, some scholarly articles and literature of this around this novel. It is a very famous novel, which is very heavily cited as well as studied in academic circles, especially in a postmodern discourse looking at literature. But I think it's also an important novel to situate in a course like this, especially in terms of what it brings in terms of perspective. So the perspective on trauma, the perspective on loss is a pseudo-comical perspective, a tragic-comic perspective, a farcical perspective. So that farcical focalization is something which we have to pay a lot of attention to as a cognitive quality of representation, as well as being reflective of the broader political scenario around that time. So I stop at this point today. I will continue with this and hopefully start looking at certain selected passages from the next session. Thank you for your attention.